Back in the times of the judges in the Bible, the nation of Israel did not have a human king. God was their leader. It was God who touched Moses' heart and made him to become the leader to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt, and they crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. It was God who led the children of Israel 40 years in the wilderness until they came to the time to cross the Jordan River. It was God who called Joshua to lead the nation of Israel after Moses died, to lead the children of Israel across the Jordan River and get into the Promised Land. And God was the direct leader of the nation of Israel. But there came a time in Israel's history when they wanted to have a human king. And they came to Samuel, and they said, Samuel, we would like to have a king like all other nations have a king. Now keep in mind, God was the leader of the nation of Israel. But they wanted to have a human king that they could see with their eyes. In fact, they told Samuel, we want a king that will go before us when we go to battle. We want to see somebody out there in front of us leading us into battle. And Samuel complained to God. He said, God, these people are asking for a king. And the Lord said to Samuel, he said, Samuel, don't get upset. He said, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. See, Samuel was the prophet of the nation of Israel at that time, and he was the spiritual leader. He was the human element leader of the nation of Israel. God would speak to Samuel, Samuel would deliver the word of God to the people, and that was the way it operated. So when the people asked for a king, Samuel got upset, and God said, Samuel, don't be upset. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. He said, but warn them, if they get a king, he's going to tax them, he's going to take part of their land, he's going to take part of their cattle, he's going to take some of their best young men to work in his armies, he's going to take your daughters to be bakers and cooks for him in his kingdom. He said, now tell the people, if that's what they want, this is what's going to happen. So Samuel told the people the warning from God, and the people said, no, we want a king. So God told Samuel, he says, make him a king. And so Saul was the first king of Israel, and he led the nation of Israel in a battle against the Ammonites in chapter 11, the previous chapter to this. And I'll just look at it real quick. In 1 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 13, it says, and Saul said, there shall not be a man put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel. Saul the king, won the battle against God's people's enemies. But he gave the credit to the Lord. He said, the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel. He gave credit to God in that day. But what happened was the people put their faith in their new king. They thought, wow, we have a king now. And God must be pleased because we just went into a battle and we won the battle with our king leading the way. And what happened was Samuel wanted to remind them that God was still their leader. Even though they had a human king, God was going to lead the nation of Israel, and their future success rested in trusting God alone. You see, it's okay to have a king, is what he was saying, but just keep one thing in mind. Who's leading the king? That's God. And God wanted to remind the children of Israel that even though you have a human king, and even though he just won this last battle, I am still the one who is ultimately, talking about God. God says, I am still the one who is ultimately in charge. Now the king is God's servant for the people, and both the people and the king have to obey God. That's how it works. You can't have the people obeying God and the king not obeying God, or vice versa. God will choose to bless a nation. What does the Bible say? Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. That means the people and the leadership of the nation must be following God. Now Samuel was the last of the judges. During the time prior to the kings, God raised up judges. Now these judges aren't judges like you and I think of judges, sitting behind a bench in a black robe, listening to people's problems and making decisions for them. These judges were military leaders. And you can read in the book of Judges how that the people, children of Israel, did evil in the sight of the Lord. And God delivered them into the hands of their enemies. And their enemies overcame them. Then they cried unto the Lord to deliver them out of the hand of their enemies. And God raised up a judge, and he delivered them out of the hand of the enemy. And that judge was a leader of the children of Israel, a military leader, and God was working through the different judges. But now there came the time of the kings. And so Samuel is getting old here in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Samuel was the prophet. He's getting ready to retire because now the people have a king. And Samuel wanted to come before the people and have a review of his life and review of his work there. But before leaving office, he wanted to set the record straight. Now, in the East, the kings and political officials often misused their office for power and money to line their own pockets. Hey, not much has changed in politics from back in the Bible times until today, right? I mean, we got these like the former governor of Illinois trying to sell Barack Obama's seat. We got the mayor of Bell padding his own salary, trying to line his pockets with a lot of money. Nothing's changed in politics over the course of human history. But Samuel wanted to set the record straight, and he wanted to tell the people that as long as he was the prophet of Israel, that he did it according to the way God led him, and his hands were clean from taking bribes and money from the people. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 12, and let's read the first 5 verses. Now, keep in mind, here's Samuel the prophet. He's getting ready to retire. The nation of Israel has a king, so now the leadership of the nation is going to turn from the prophet over to the king, and Samuel is giving his final address to the people. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1. And Samuel said unto all Israel, Behold, I have hearkened unto your voice in all that ye said unto me, and have made a king over you. And now, behold, the king walketh before you. And I am old and gray-headed, and behold, my sons are with you, and I have walked before you from my childhood unto this day. Behold, here I am. Witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose ass have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or of whose hand have I received any bribe to blind mine eyes therewith? And I will restore it unto you. And they said, Oh, thou hast not defrauded us, nor oppressed us, neither hast thou taken aught of any man's hand. And he said unto them, The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that ye have not found aught in my hand. And they answered, He is witness. So here's Samuel. He's standing before the people, and he said, Look, as long as I've been your leadership, I have not taken anything from you. I have not taken any of your oxen. I have not taken any of your donkeys. I have not oppressed you. I have not defrauded you. I have not taken anything that belongs to you and taken it as my own. And he says, I want to know, does anybody have anything to say about this? Can anybody say that I've defrauded them? And the people said, Oh no, Samuel, you didn't do anything wrong. You were a great a prophet of God and the leader of the children of Israel. And Samuel said, Okay, then you are witnesses this day that I am presenting to you the fact that I'm finishing my work here, and I have done my job right, and I have not taken anything that did not belong to me, and I have not defrauded you. And the people said, Oh yeah, Samuel, you're right. You were a good guy. You did not do any of those wrong things. Now the people bore witness to the truth. But now Samuel wants to give a history lesson to the children of Israel. And Samuel wants to remind the children of Israel, just like I want to remind you today. He wanted to remind the children of Israel that even though they have a king, God is still in full control, and God is still leading that nation of Israel. And that's what I'm trying to point out to you today through this lesson, that even though we have an interim pastor, Brother Allen, but even though we don't have our next pastor in place yet, God is still in control of the church. This church belongs to Jesus Christ, and he is leading this church, and God is in full control. And Samuel wanted to remind the people that even though they had great leaders in their history, it was still God was in control and working through those leaders that they had. Look at verse 6. And Samuel said to the people, It is the Lord that advanced Moses and Aaron and brought your fathers out of the land of Egypt. Now therefore, stand still, that I may reason with you before the Lord, and all the righteous acts of the Lord which he did to you and your fathers. Samuel said, now look, listen up. That's what he said. Stand still that I may reason with you. It's like you're going before a judge in a courtroom. He goes, stand up, let me talk to you. Now Samuel was telling the people, listen to me. It was God who led Moses and Aaron. It wasn't Moses and Aaron. And Samuel, during this passage of scripture here that we're reading, he refers to the Lord over 30 times. And the purpose for that is Samuel is wanting the people to take their emphasis off the eyes of the human leader that they had and realize that behind that leadership, God is in control. And that's what Samuel is trying to get across to these people, because now they have a king. And Samuel understood that it was very easy for the people to follow the king, to worship the king, to bow down to the king, especially if the king is winning battles and especially if the king's doing a good job and he's leading the nation of Israel in a right way. The natural tendency for human beings is to follow the leadership that they can see with their eyes, and they forget the fact that ultimately God is in charge and God is leading. And so Samuel's going to give them a little history lesson here, and he's going to talk to them about how God led. He's emphasizing what God did through the human leaders. Look at verse 8. When Jacob was come into Egypt, and your fathers cried unto the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, which brought forth your fathers out of Egypt, and made them dwell in this place. And when they forgat the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the captain of the host of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against him, they cried unto the Lord, and said, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord, and have served Baalim and Ashtaroth. But now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies, and we will serve thee. And the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Berdan and Jephthah and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies every side, and ye dwelled safe. He's telling the people, look, God raised up all these leaders, and he listed several of them, Jerubbaal and Bethah and Jephthah and Samuel. He said, whenever the nation of Israel got into trouble, God would raise up a man, and he would use that man in order to deliver them out of the troubles. But it wasn't the man that did it. It was God. It was God working through that human leader. It was God working through the king of Israel. It's God working through the prophets of the nation of Israel. Yes, the prophet had the human element. Yes, the king was involved in the decision making. But if the people and the king got their eyes off of God, they were in trouble. But as long as they realized that they have a king, a flesh and blood king that they can see with their eyes, that's all well and good. But keep one thing in mind, that king better keep his eyes on the Lord, and the people better keep their eyes on the Lord. But what happens is, when the nation of Israel had a king right before them, they got to focusing on the king. And it was like they were forgetting about the fact that God was in control in heaven, and he was the one who was guiding the king. He was the one who was blessing the king. He was the one who was giving the king the wisdom that he had in his brain and giving him the ideas that he used for battle, especially if the king was a wise king and went and cried to the Lord and prayed to the Lord and asked for wisdom. So Samuel here in this passage of scripture is getting ready to retire, and he's rehearsing in the minds of the people, okay, you've had human leaders before. You had Moses, you had Aaron, you had Joshua, you had all these people, but it was ultimately God was the one who was in charge, and God was the one who was calling the shots, and that's what gave the children of Israel their success. And so Samuel is trying to get them to understand that what they need to do is realize that the Lord is faithful, but Israel, whenever they become disobedient, then God will punish them. Look at verse 12. And when ye saw Nahash, the king of the children of Ammon, came against you, ye said unto me, Nay, but a king shall reign over us, and the Lord your God was your king. Now therefore behold the king which ye have chosen, and whom ye've desired, and behold the Lord hath set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord, and serve him, and obey his voice, and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then shall both ye and also the king that reigneth over you continue following the Lord your God. But If ye will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then shall the hand of the Lord be against you as it was against your fathers. Now here, what he was telling them, he says, fear the Lord. That's what he said in verse 13. And he's talking about fearing God. Now that word, when you read in the Bible about fearing God, that doesn't mean that you and I need to fear God, and we cower down and we're nervous about what he's going to do. Is he going to zap us from heaven? No, that fear, when you read in the Bible where it talks about fearing the Lord or the fear, that means a reverential trust. That means we realize who God is and we respect him for who he is. Sort of like when you go into court. When you go into court, you better speak very carefully to that judge that's sitting behind that bench, because he has the power to make it go one way or the other. And now so what you do is you give that judge respect. You call him your honor. And when he asks you a question, it's yes, sir, no, sir. One of the best things, if you ever get stopped, let me give you a word of advice. And Brother Bill Wynn was a LA County sheriff for 34 years? 36 years. And he'll tell you the same thing. My son-in-law is a Louisiana State Trooper, and they'll all tell you the same thing. You know what's the best thing you could say to a police officer when he stops you? Just say, yes, sir. If he asks you a question, yes, sir. No, sir. You show respect. That gets you a long way. And what Samuel is telling the people here is that you need to fear the Lord. And once again, that doesn't mean that they're afraid of what God's going to do. It's a reverential trust. Respecting who he is, understanding what he has the power to do, and giving him that trust and that respect that's due. So Samuel's telling the people that they need to show gratitude and trust unto the Lord. Gratitude for what he has done and brought you to this point, and then trust him that he's going to continue to do that. And here at First Baptist Church Lima, we're getting ready to celebrate our 119th anniversary on May the 20th. And we can look back on the history of this church and watch God's guiding hand on this church as it started with those 15 people back in May 20th, 1894, who signed a covenant that said, we, the undersigned Baptists, do hereby to covenant with each other that we will use the talents that God has given us to build a Baptist church here in Long Beach. And those from the time those people signed that document in 1894 until the time that we are here today in 2013, God has led this church. And we need to look back on the past and understand that God is in control. And we show gratitude and we show thanks. That's why from time to time I'll refer to different things about the history of our church. We dare not forget those people who came before us. We are sitting in buildings today. We're sitting on property today that we did not purchase, but people who have come before us have purchased. And God led those people to move the church from 4th and Locust, where they were for 44 years, to come over to this property. And God led them to give of their means to the offering so that this building could be built, so that this church could be here. So we show gratitude not only to the people who have come before us, but to the God that led those people. A lot of times it's easy to say, well, in the past, this pastor did this and this pastor did that. Well, wait a minute. It was God who led the church, who led that pastor to do these things. And so Samuel's rehearsing in the minds of the people that you need to realize that God is ultimately in control, even though you have a human king. And if you fear the Lord, everything is going to go well with you and your king. But, like he said in verse 15, if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then shall the hand of the Lord be against you as it was your fathers. You see, the children of Israel need to stop and realize, go back in their history and read what happens in the book of Judges when the people turned away from God and started worshiping the false gods of the people around them. God came in and punished them. And then they had to have a deliverer. And then they had to go through struggles. And then God had to deliver them from the hands of their enemies. And then what happened? They did it again. The children of Israel did it. You read the book of Judges, and you'll see this pattern over and over again. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. God delivered them into the hand of their enemies. They cried unto the Lord because of what the enemies are doing unto them. And then God would raise up a deliverer, a judge, and deliver them out of the hands of their enemies. And then you read on a little bit later, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And God delivered them into the hand of their enemies. And then they cried unto the Lord because of the enemies that are doing it. And then God raised up a judge to deliver them out of their hand. And that pattern keeps going over and over and over again in the book of Judges. So what Samuel is telling the people, he said, learn from your fathers. If you disobey the Lord, the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. Go look at history. The old quote is still true. Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And these people, Samuel was, as he was getting ready to retire, and he's giving this farewell speech to the people as their leader, as a prophet, now that they have a king, he was telling them, you need to fear the Lord and realize that even though you've had leaders in the past, those leaders were guided by God. And as long as you and your king are following God, things will go well for you and your king. But if you forsake the Lord, then he will turn his hand against you, just like he did that your fathers. So what happened was they had this king, and now Samuel wants to give them a demonstration. You see, in the Old Testament, God gave a lot of times miracles that these prophets would perform. Look what Moses was able to do. Moses goes to Pharaoh. Let the children of Israel go. And Pharaoh said, no. And then the rivers turned to blood, and then they had the locust all over the land, and they had all the 10 plagues of Israel. God used miracles back in that day to authenticate the ministry of the prophet. And now Samuel is going to give a little demonstration. He's going to give a little show and tell to the children of Israel. What happens if you don't listen to the Lord and don't follow what he says? Look at verse 16. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 16. Now Samuel's talking to the children. He says, now therefore stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Samuel said, I want to give you a little demonstration, folks. I want to show you what happens when you don't follow God and you don't listen to what God says. Verse 17. Is it not wheat harvest today? I will call upon the Lord, and he shall send thunder and rain. Now wait a minute. You don't want it to be raining when you're trying to harvest crops. That's why what they would do is they would wait until the winter time was over, when the rainy season was done and the growing season was done. Then everything started drying out, and then it was time to you wanted to make sure you get the harvest done before the next rainy season starts. It's next to impossible to harvest when it's raining and everything, the land turns into mud and the crops are all wet and you can't bring them in. So Samuel says, I'm going to give you a demonstration. He says, I am going to pray unto the Lord. He says, I will call unto the Lord that he shall send thunder, this is verse 17, that he shall send thunder and rain, that ye may perceive and see your wickedness is great, which ye have done in the sight of the Lord in asking you a king. Samuel says, it normally doesn't rain this time of the year. This would be the equivalent of somebody coming to you in the middle of July and say, I'm going to pray a big whopping rainstorm here in Southern California. And the people go, wow, it never, from about April till November, we don't see any rain here in Southern California. And during harvest time, these people didn't see rain. And Samuel said, I'm going to show you what can happen to you if you don't follow God. Isn't this wheat harvest? He said, I'm going to pray that God would send a rainstorm. Now, in these people's minds, they would think, man, that's never happened in this time of the year. If it does, this is going to be something big. And so what happened? Look what happens. Verse 18. So Samuel called unto the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day. And all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And all the people said unto Samuel, pray for thy servants unto the Lord, that we die not. For we have added unto our sins and evil, and ask us this king. So here Samuel's trying to show these people, this is what happens if you're not going to. He said, I'm going to pray. And sure enough, here comes a rainstorm in the middle of harvest time, at a time when it would never rain in the Middle East. And here comes this rainstorm, and all of a sudden the people realized, whoa, this man Samuel was telling us the truth. Look at this. We've never had rain like this. So they come to Samuel. They say, oh, Samuel, please help us. Pray for us. And so then look at verse 20. And Samuel said to the people, fear not. Ye have done all this wickedness, yet turn not aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your hearts. Israel's already asked for the king. God already told Samuel, make him a king. Now they have this king. And Samuel's trying to get them to understand that even though you have a king, you better ultimately understand that God is the one who's in control. And if you forget that, God can punish you. And he demonstrates that by bringing a rainstorm in the middle of harvest. Now, they've already got the king. You know, what's the old saying? You can't unring a bell. You ever hear that? The old folks used to say that. You cannot unring a bell. They can't go back and redo this whole thing again. They came to God. They rejected the leadership of the prophets. They asked God for a king. God told Samuel, make him a king. Now they have a king. Now what are they going to do? Well, all is not lost. Samuel tells them what you can do is fear the Lord. Samuel encouraged the people to accept the situation that their unbelief has created and make the most of it. Let's look at verse 20. Samuel said to the people, fear not. Ye have done this wickedness. Ye turn not aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And turn ye not aside, for then should ye go after vain things which cannot profit nor deliver, for they are vain. For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it hath pleased the Lord to make you his people. Samuel said, what you need to do is make the best of the situation and realize that, okay, you made a mistake. You asked for a king. You rejected my leadership. You wanted a human king. But now what you need to do is fear the Lord. Go back and turn that attention that you would give to a king and turn it back unto the Lord, realizing that God is the one who's in charge. So what Samuel was saying was, this situation is not hopeless, folks. Okay, you made a mistake. You asked for a king. You have this king. But remember, ultimately, go one step beyond the king and fear the Lord. Realize that God's in control. Give him the trust that he well deserves. Look back at your history and understand that even though you've had leaders in the past, it was God who was in charge. And now that you have a king, and now that you've made this mistake, you can go on because God will not forsake his people for his name's sake. And you just need to fear the Lord. The tendency is that Samuel is trying to encourage the people just to make the most of it now. It's not doom and gloom. This is not history forever. We often receive what we ask for and then wished we hadn't. You ever done that before? I have. You pray for something, oh God, I need this. And all of a sudden you get that something and it ends up costing you money or causes you problems, and you say, well, that's why I always tell people, be careful what you pray for, because God might just give you what you want. That's why when we pray, we always need to pray and ask God for his will in the matter, because we don't always know what's best for us. And so here the people, not following God's will, they asked for a king, they got a king, and now they got this king, and they thought, oh man, this is a mistake. And Samuel says, okay, but hang on. This is not hopeless. You just need to continue to fear the Lord, because the Lord is the one who can bless. The Lord is the one who can bring blessings to you and your king as long as you follow God. They asked for a king, and they exchanged the rule of God for a mortal man. Now, that can happen very easily in a church situation. A lot of people can get infatuated with the pastor of the church, and they want to do something to please him. And there's nothing wrong with loving the pastor. There's nothing wrong in wanting to do nice things for the pastor. But if you do that without a regard for God, then what you have done is you have transferred your love and your loyalty from God to that human leader. And that's a dangerous situation, because God is ultimately the one who leads and guides and blesses. And that's what Samuel was trying to get these people to understand, that even though you have a king, you need to understand that God is still in control. And that's what I would like to make sure to talk to you today as we're getting ready to get a new pastor come into this church, that realize, yes, we're going to love our new pastor when he comes here. Yes, we're going to want to do things to please him, but ultimately we need to make sure that we understand that the most important person that we please, the most important person that we need to follow, the most important thing we need to do is put our faith and trust in God. because God will lead and bless this church as we look to him. Yes, he will bring, it's God's plan that churches have a pastor. We can read that in the New Testament. Churches have a pastor. Churches have deacons. Those are the only two offices in the Bible that God mentions is for the church. It's God's plan to have an assembly of believers together and to have a pastor over a shepherd, a bishop, an overseer. Those are the words that the Bible uses. It's God's plan. We're gonna end up with a new pastor, but we have to ultimately understand that God is still in control of the church because he is the one who loves the church. Now, these people asked for a king, and they got the rule of a man instead of the rule of God, and in that exchange, the nation of Israel lost because now they have a king, and now they have to be careful to make sure that they follow God's will. However, all was not lost because God is never taken by surprise. As I told you many times, and those of you who have been in my Sunday school class for any length of time, I've told you many times, God never looks down from heaven and says, oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. That never happens. God knows the future. He knows everything. So God will not desert his people for his name's sake. As long as the people are giving God the proper due trust, God the proper due reverence, they're giving to God the credit for everything that's done. How many times have you heard Pastor Wilkerson said when he was here for those 12 years, I want to be a part of something that only God can explain. It has nothing to do with the human leadership. It has nothing to do with what I can do. It's what God can do through us as a church. Now, if the people would fear the Lord and follow him, he would continue to care for them and direct them. And God's purpose was to use Israel, the nation of Israel, to bring him his glory. So if the Jewish people knew the terms of the covenant of God, if you obey, then God will bless. If you disobey, then you'll get punished. Now, Samuel was on his way out, and he told them that he would be praying for them. Look at verse 22 again. For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it hath pleased the Lord to make you his people. Moreover, as for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. Samuel says, I know you guys made a mistake, but I'm not going to abandon you either. I'm going to continue to pray for you. And I'm still going to be around, even though I'm not going to be the leader of the nation, but I'm still a prophet of God, and I will be there, he says, and I will teach you the good and the right way. Samuel says, it's not like, okay, folks, you asked for a king. I told you not to do it. You didn't listen to me. You wanted a king. God gave you a king. Hey, happy birthday. I hope you're happy. Here you go. I'm out of here wiping my hand. No, that's not what Samuel did. Samuel said, okay, I'm still going to be here, and God forbid that I would cease not to continue to pray for you. Samuel said, I'm going to pray that God would give his leadership to this nation and to this king. And he said, I'm going to still be around to teach you. And then look at verse 24. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he hath done for you. If we consider what God has done, how could we do anything else but fear him and thank him and obey him? If we just stop and consider, a lot of times we get so busy we don't stop and think. We need to stop and realize where God has brought us to this point. 12 years ago, this church was nearly $1 million in debt. 12 years ago, this church it was Pastor Wilkerson's first Sunday here. There was 150 people in the Sunday morning church service, and he told me, he says, most of them sat toward the back of the auditorium, like, okay, we got this new pastor, we're going to scope him out and see who he is and see what he's like. And it was different back in that day. When I came in here, they only had one bus and one shuttle bus. Now we got 15 buses. When Pastor Wilkerson came here, the church had 58 missionaries. Now we have 400 and I can't even remember the number, 430 or 440 missionaries. So if we stop and consider what God has done. Now, no human element could have ever done what God has done over the last 12 years. Pastor Wilkerson will tell you. He's told me many times, he said, Jerry, he says, I travel around, and when I go, people ask me, say, when you get to that church was $1 million in debt, and they only had one bus, and they only had 58 missionaries, and they were behind in their bills and all that. How did you do it? Pastor Wilkerson says, I always tell him the same answer every time. He said, I didn't do it. He said, God did it. And that's the way it needs to be. We need to realize that, stop and consider. Stop and look at the past and realize, who is it that brought us to this point? How is it that this church today is completely debt-free? How is it that the bus ministry is rolling? How is it that the attendance is holding up even though our pastor has left? How is it that our financial situation has not suffered since the loss of our pastor? I think it's because Pastor Wilkerson prepared us very well to understand that it's not about him, it's about God. And God is in control. And if God lead him to go to another church to become pastor, then God will have somebody else to come into here. And he's always been that way. We're supposed to be like a mirror. If somebody wants to give us credit for something, hold up a mirror and point the credit up to God. Say, sorry, you're thanking the wrong person. Sorry, I appreciate the fact that you want to say something nice to me, but if anything good's happened, thank God. Thank the Lord for what's going on, because he's the one who's ultimately in charge. And in the midst of change, we need to stop and realize that even though our physical leader will change, we're going to get a new pastor into this church, but it's the same operation as it's always been. God is in control. God is the one who has orchestrated the events of the history of this church. God is the one who has led this church out of the $1 million in debt. God is the one who has taken this church and brought it from running about 700 on Sunday to averaging about 22 to 2,300 on Sunday. That is not a human element. That's God. And so we need to stop and realize during this time of change, just like Samuel gathered the people together and he wanted to warn them, you have a king, but remember, you need to fear the Lord. And that's the message that I bring to you today through this lesson. We're going to get a new pastor, but remember, ultimately, God is the one who's in charge of this whole thing. God is the one who has brought us in history up to this point. God is the one who has blessed this church and made us to get to this point where we are. And we need to stop and realize that all of a sudden, we're not going to just turn all of our love and affection onto a human leader. Yes, we're going to love him, and yes, we're going to appreciate him, and yes, we're going to do things for him. But we understand, ultimately, God is in control. God is the one who has led this church. God is the one who has directed this church. And God will be the one who will direct this church. And we need to do what Samuel told the children of Israel. We need to fear the Lord, follow him, and remember that he is the one who gets the praise and glory. See, God puts people on this earth to do different things for him. The problem is, a lot of times people like to take the glory and the credit for themselves. There's nobody can take credit for this. And as I said before, I like the statement Pastor Wilkerson always said. He said, I've always wanted to be a part of something that only God can explain, because otherwise it wasn't God. And thank God for his leadership in this church. I would urge you to pray for our pulpit committee. I would urge you to pray for God to continue to lead this church during this transition time, and pray that as God brings in a new pastor, that we would still continue to keep our love and affection towards Jesus Christ and towards the leadership that he has provided for this church.